It starts in silence. No fights, no long speeches, just a sudden quiet stop. Two people who used to orbit each other simply don't anymore. The messages fade, the calls end, and what seems like the end of the story is actually the beginning of a psychological shift that neither of you fully sees coming. This is the moment where the emotional landscape starts to rearrange itself. For a dismissive avoidant, silence has always been a shield. Pulling back meant safety, control, power. They believed that by retreating they could dictate the rhythm. And for you, chasing became second nature, filling the gaps, holding the bridge, keeping the connection alive even when it wasn't being reciprocated. But now, both of you have stopped. No contact on both sides. Strategic silence, whether intentional or not, sets the stage for something deeper. From the outside, it looks like nothing's happening. Two people going their separate ways. But beneath that calm surface, something real begins to stir. The ego that relied on being chased starts to tremble. The part of you that couldn't stand silence begins to breathe in it. What feels like stillness is actually movement, not in texts or calls, but in psychological gravity, shifting from one side to the other. This is where power dynamics quietly flip. Most people never talk about this phase. They focus on the dramatic exits, the emotional confrontations, the big closure moments, but real change happens in the spaces where nothing seems to happen. It's in the unanswered notifications, the nights where you fight the urge to text, the subtle curiosity that starts creeping into their mind when your usual patterns don't return. The silent treatment effect works both ways, but only one side is usually aware of it. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, no contact is supposed to be their safe zone. They expect to feel in control while you spiral in uncertainty. They expect you to break the silence first. But when you don't, their certainty begins to crack. That's when the quiet questions start. Why haven't they reached out? Did they move on? Did I misread the dynamic? They won't say it out loud, but the power of absence is now working against them. What they once used as a wall is slowly turning into a mirror. And for you, this silence is no longer a punishment. It's an initiation. At first, it shakes your reflexes. The urge to send just one message, to check their profile, to find some sign that they still care. But with each day you hold the line, the emotional control starts shifting back into your hands. Stoicism in this context isn't about pretending you don't feel. It's about choosing not to let impulse dictate your next move. Strategic silence becomes your ally, not your enemy. This video isn't about playing games. It's about understanding the hidden psychological mechanics that unfold when both people stop contacting each other. The external world sees nothing, but beneath the surface, something powerful happens. Ego cracks, control flips, emotional habits get exposed, and both sides are forced to face the reality that words usually cover up. Before we dive into this journey, if this message resonates with you and you want to support this kind of content, you can click the Super Thanks button below. It's not about charity, it's about strengthening a space where we talk about the silent, strategic side of human dynamics that no one else explains like this. Your support allows these messages to keep reaching the people who need them most. Because what happens in this silent space changes everything. This is where obsession starts to replace control. This is where detachment is born. This is where the game quietly, invisibly flips. When two people stop contacting each other, it never feels loud. There's no dramatic scene, no last message that explains everything. It just fades. One day the phone lights up a little less, then not at all. What's left is a quiet that doesn't shout. It lingers. At first it seems like nothing is happening. But that silence isn't empty. It's loaded. Two people, each carrying their own wounds, suddenly stop the familiar dance of pursuit and retreat. The stage goes dark, and what was once hidden starts to surface. For someone with a dismissive avoidant mindset, this moment feels like control. They've always believed distance protects them. Strategic silence is their shield. No contact means no pressure, no emotional exposure, no chance of rejection. They tell themselves they're relieved, but that relief isn't stable. It's temporary. For you, it feels like a void opening up. Your mind is trained to chase. Every time they pulled away, you reached out. That pattern became muscle memory. Now, with both sides silent, that muscle starts to twitch, looking for something to hold on to. The early days of silence are deceptive. On the outside, it looks like nothing has changed, but beneath the surface, psychological forces are shifting. The avoidant feels powerful at first. They've always relied on your predictability. Your messages gave them control. But when they don't come, there's a tiny crack in their armor. Why aren't they texting? It starts as a quiet question, easy to brush off, but silence has a way of echoing back. What was once comfortable, distance begins to feel unfamiliar. Their sense of control depends on you staying in the loop. The moment you step out, that balance starts to tilt. For you, the silence hits differently. At first, it's all discomfort. Checking your phone, replaying old moments, fighting the urge to reach out. But somewhere in that discomfort, something shifts. You start noticing how much energy you've spent holding things together alone. You see the pattern for what it was. One person pulling away, the other filling the gap. And for the first time, you're not filling it. You're letting the gap exist. That decision, quiet as it seems, is the beginning of emotional control. Silence isn't passive. It's not doing nothing. It's an invisible force that reveals what's real. When the noise fades for the dismissive avoidant, the absence they once used to protect themselves starts turning into a mirror. Their ego, built on the certainty of being chased, feels the first tremors of collapse. For you, what felt like ego collapse starts transforming into something steadier. Detachment. Not the cold kind. The kind that comes when you stop handing your power away. This is the part no one sees. Two people, both silent, both believing they're in control of the story. One hides behind distance, thinking they've won. The other learns that silence, when chosen from self-respect, isn't weakness. It's leverage. Stoicism isn't about shutting off emotion. It's about letting the silence do what chasing never could. shift the power dynamics. And in that quiet space, everything starts to change. The avoidance relief turns into curiosity, then discomfort. Your anxiety turns into clarity. Neither side makes a move, but the ground beneath both starts to move. This is where the real story begins. Not with a message sent, but with the silence that exposes everything left unsaid. Silence looks simple from the outside, but underneath, two completely different emotional worlds are colliding. On one side, there's the dismissive avoidant. Someone who spent years building emotional armor so thick that distance feels safer than closeness. For them, silence equals control. Pulling back is their way of avoiding vulnerability, pain, or rejection. They believe if they don't reach out, they can't be hurt. Strategic silence has always been their strongest psychological tactic. On the other side, there's you. Someone who's been trained by the dynamic to fill every gap they create. When they retreated, you advanced. When they went cold, you warmed things up. It became a rhythm, even if it was exhausting. And now suddenly, that rhythm is gone. The avoidant mind reacts to silence in layers. At first, there's relief. It's like they've successfully regained control of the emotional landscape. No contact feels like safety. They tell themselves they don't need connection. They convince themselves this is strength. But that strength isn't real. It's a shield against the discomfort they've never learned to face. As the days pass, the initial relief gives way to something quieter, something they can't fully name. Their certainty begins to flicker. They're used to you holding the bridge, making sure the story doesn't end. When that bridge disappears, their control doesn't feel as solid anymore. For you, the silence is a psychological X-ray. It reveals patterns you couldn't see while you were busy chasing. You start to notice how much of the dynamic depended on your emotional labor. Your constant reassurance, your quick replies, your willingness to hold space when they couldn't. It's uncomfortable to see, but it's also clarifying. The no contact rule isn't just about them. It's about seeing yourself without the noise. In that stillness, the truth emerges. They weren't the only one controlling the rhythm. You were too. Just from the opposite side. This is where the power dynamics start to shift, invisibly. The avoidant, used to emotional predictability, senses something is different. They may not admit it, but deep down, a quiet tension builds. It's not about missing you yet. It's about the structure they relied on suddenly being gone. Meanwhile, your nervous system, once conditioned to react, begins to slow down. The initial panic softens. You start to understand that silence isn't the enemy. It's information. It shows you who moves when the music stops. The dismissive avoidant often hides behind logic. They tell themselves stories like, if they don't text, it means they don't care. Or, I knew it wouldn't last. But those are protective narratives. Behind them is fear of abandonment. Fear of being truly seen. Fear of needing someone who might not stay. When you stop reaching out, that fear has nowhere to hide. It doesn't explode. Habits you didn't even realize you had. You see how often you reached out, not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid of losing control. You understand how much of your self-worth was tied to their responses, and this realization doesn't break you, it steadies you. Stoicism isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about seeing the dynamic clearly, without illusions, and choosing how to act instead of reacting blindly. Two internal realities, once entangled in an unbalanced dance, are now standing on their own. The avoidant tries to hide behind their fortress, unaware that the foundation is starting to shake. You stand in the silence, uncomfortable, but more awake than ever. This is the hidden battlefield of psychological warfare, not in loud confrontations, but in quiet spaces where truth has nowhere to hide. And as both sides face this invisible shift, the question becomes who adapts and who clings to the old pattern. There comes a moment when the silence stops feeling accidental and starts feeling deliberate. It's no longer about waiting for the next message or wondering if they'll make a move. It's about you making a choice. A quiet, calculated decision to stop chasing what keeps slipping away. At first, this decision doesn't feel powerful. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff without a rope. Your instincts scream to reach out, to send a simple hey, just to feel something familiar. But instead of acting on impulse, you pause. And in that pause, something shifts. This is the point where many break the no contact rule. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they underestimate the psychological grip of old patterns. Reaching out has always been the way to soothe the anxiety, to fill the gap, to feel like the story isn't over. But now you see it for what it is, a loop. Every time they pulled back, you filled the space. Every time they hid, you made it safe for them to return. And every time you did, the dynamic stayed exactly the same. So this time, you decide not to. Strategic silence. Habits you didn't even realize you had. You see how often you reached out? Not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid of losing control. You understand how much of your self-worth was tied to their responses. And this realization doesn't break you. It steadies you. Stoicism isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about seeing the dynamic clearly, without illusions, and choosing how to act, instead of reacting blindly. Two internal realities, once entangled in an unbalanced dance, are now standing on their own. The avoidant tries to hide behind their fortress, unaware that the foundation is starting to shake. You stand in the silence, uncomfortable, but more awake than ever. This is the hidden battlefield of psychological warfare, not in loud confrontations, but in quiet spaces where truth has nowhere to hide. And as both sides face this invisible shift, the question becomes, who adapts and who clings to the old pattern? There comes a moment when the silence stops feeling accidental and starts feeling deliberate. It's no longer about waiting for the next message or wondering if they'll make a move. It's about you making a choice. A quiet, calculated decision to stop chasing what keeps slipping away. At first, this decision doesn't feel powerful. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff without a rope. Your instincts scream to reach out, to send a simple hey, just to feel something familiar. But instead of acting on impulse, you pause. And in that pause, something shifts. This is the point where many break the no-contact rule. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they underestimate the psychological grip of old patterns. Reaching out has always been the way to soothe the anxiety, to fill the gap, to feel like the story isn't over. But now, you see it for what it is, a loop. Every time they pulled back, you filled the space. Every time they hid, you made it safe for them to return. And every time you did, the dynamic stayed exactly the same. So this time, you decide not to. Strategic silence, explaining, clarifying, or chasing your living. And because of that, the balance starts to tilt. The power of absence begins to work. The avoidant's usual sense of safety and distance starts to crack, because the emotional bridge they relied on is gone. They can't control what they don't receive. Their strategies, the cold response, the calculated withdrawal, lose their effect when you don't react. For you, this stage isn't about pretending not to care. It's about moving through your life without constantly circling back to the same emotional loop. The silence doesn't feel heavy anymore. It starts to feel clean. The space that once belonged to waiting now belongs to growth. You find yourself thinking more clearly, sleeping better, breathing easier. It's not instant. It's quiet, gradual, almost invisible. But it's real. And on the other side, their inner landscape shifts too. They may not admit it, but they feel the gap widening. Their strategic silence was supposed to keep them safe while still keeping you close. But now the distance they created is becoming the distance they can't control. Their fortress starts to feel more like a cage. And as that realization slowly builds, the dynamic continues to change. Not because of a dramatic gesture, but because you stayed still long enough for the silence to do its work. This is the stage where silence starts to pull hidden strings on both sides. The initial quiet has passed. The routines are changing. But underneath, something more subtle begins to unfold. The testing phase. For someone with a dismissive avoidant mindset, control has always lived in predictability. They retreat, you chase. They feel safe. But now the script is broken. You're no longer moving according to their pattern, and that unsettles them. So they test. Not directly, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, calculated moves designed to measure your emotional temperature without exposing theirs. It starts small. A story view here, a like on an old post there. Maybe a random meme sent out of nowhere. Light, casual, intentionally meaningless on the surface, but underneath, every breadcrumb they drop has a purpose, to see if you'll pick it up. They want to know if your attention is still locked on them. If you respond too fast, they get the confirmation they crave, that the power dynamic still belongs to them. If you don't respond, a new wave of curiosity begins to grow inside them. For someone who's built their identity around emotional distance, uncertainty is the one thing that makes their armor tremble. For you, this phase is psychological quicksand. These small signals can pull at old reflexes. A single like can send your brain spinning into overdrive. Does this mean they miss me? Are they trying to reconnect? Your impulses flare up, pushing you toward the familiar loop, reaching out, breaking the silence, resetting the dynamic. But this is where strategic silence reveals its true weight. Not reacting doesn't mean pretending not to care. It means recognizing these moves for what they are: emotional probes, not genuine reconnection. Each time you resist the urge to respond, you disrupt the old rhythm. You keep the power of absence intact. Your silence becomes less about holding back and more about observing clearly. You see their tactics without being pulled into them. This is where Stoicism becomes something practical, not an abstract idea, but a lived discipline. Emotional control shows up in the milliseconds between impulse and action. You learn to sit with the urge, to breathe through it, to let the moment pass without giving away your ground. Meanwhile, their testing intensifies in subtle ways. When the light touches don't get a response, they might up the ante. A comment on your post, a casual "hey" out of nowhere. Not vulnerability, but another controlled risk to see if the door is still open. The avoidant doesn't leap. They edge closer, watching your reaction like a mirror reflecting their own uncertainty. Your lack of quick response forces them to feel what they've spent years avoiding: doubt, insecurity, and the fear of being truly left behind you. On the other hand, are no longer trapped in the same psychological loop. Each test they throw your way becomes proof of the shift that's already happening. You're not chasing breadcrumbs anymore. You're watching the pattern reveal itself. That doesn't mean the impulses disappear. They don't. Old habits whisper late at night. But your silence speaks louder now. It tells them their usual methods don't work the same way anymore. This is the tug of war in its quietest, most dangerous form. No loud fights, no confrontations. Just two minds adjusting to a new power dynamic. One tries to pull you back into the old rhythm without admitting it. The other holds steady, watching the structure of the dynamic slowly bend. And in that subtle tension, everything starts to unravel. Not through action, but through restraint. This is the point where silence stops feeling like a tactic and starts becoming transformation. The early discomfort has burned away, and what's left is something quieter, deeper, a growing stability inside you. At the beginning, every moment of no contact felt like walking through a storm without an umbrella. Now, it feels like standing in still air. The urge to check, to reach, to break, the quiet still appears from time to time, but it no longer runs the show. Emotional control has settled in like steady ground beneath your feet. What once felt unbearable is starting to feel natural. Your focus slowly shifts inward. Instead of analyzing their silence, you start noticing your own growth. You see how much of your emotional energy used to orbit around their actions. The waiting, the decoding, the constant self-questioning. Strategic silence has forced you to look at what was always there, but buried under reaction. Your own capacity to anchor yourself. This is where Stoicism becomes something tangible. You're not just surviving the silence, you're shaping yourself through it. On their side, the silence starts to echo differently. For the dismissive avoidant, emotional distance was supposed to keep them safe, while ensuring you remained tethered. But as time passes, that distance begins to turn into a void they can't control. The ego that once relied on your predictability starts to wobble. They may not admit it even to themselves, but the absence they counted on as protection is now poking at their insecurities. Late at night, when distractions fade, the quiet becomes louder. They think about why you haven't broken the pattern. They replay small moments they dismissed before. They wonder if they've lost their grip. You, meanwhile, start experiencing the silence as clarity. The space that used to feel like punishment now feels like freedom. You're no longer reacting to their absence. You're defining yourself through it. You notice the emotional distance growing, but this time it doesn't scare you. It feels earned. You're not numbing yourself. You're steadying yourself. That's the difference. This stage isn't flashy. There's no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden external sign. It's quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but inside, everything is shifting. You find new routines. You invest your energy in things that feed you instead of drain you. The narrative that once revolved around them is being rewritten in real time, line by line. You're not waiting for them to return anymore. You're becoming someone who doesn't need that return to feel whole. For the avoidant, this internal transformation doesn't go unnoticed. Even from a distance, they sense energetic changes. The emotional pull they used to rely on starts to weaken. That's what rattles them. Not the silence itself, but the fact that it's no longer temporary background noise. It's becoming the new normal. Their usual fallback, waiting until you reach out again, no longer feels guaranteed. And that uncertainty quietly stirs something they're not used to confronting. Their fear of being forgotten. This is consolidation. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about no longer letting their behavior dictate your emotional climate. It's about building something inside yourself that can't be dismantled by a message that never arrives. While they wrestle with the cracks forming in their armor, you stand still, grounded, watching the landscape of the dynamic reshape itself. The silence isn't just a gap anymore. It's the place where you found your footing. And that internal shift changes everything that comes next. Time has passed. The silence is no longer new. It's become the air between you. What began as hesitation has turned into a full psychological recalibration. And now the consequences start to surface. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. On their side, the dismissive avoidant begins to feel the weight of what they once believed they controlled. Silence was their territory. Distance was their shield. They thought that by pulling back, they could keep you close, on their terms. But as weeks turned into months, and your absence held steady, the cracks in that illusion started to widen. At first, it's subtle. A quiet discomfort creeps in during moments when they used to expect your attention. They open their phone without knowing why. They glance at old messages, scroll through your feed, hover over your profile. It's not nostalgia, yet. It's confusion. Their mind is trying to make sense of a dynamic that no longer plays by familiar rules. Strategic silence has flipped the emotional power dynamic. The person who used silence to feel in control now finds themselves haunted by it, As time stretches on, that confusion turns into something heavier. The ego that once stood tall starts to tremble. They think back to the certainty they used to have, that no matter how far they withdrew, you'd always be there to bridge the gap. Now the bridge is gone, and they're standing on their side of the divide, realizing it doesn't feel as safe as they imagined. Avoidant attachment feeds on predictability. When the pattern breaks, the mind that relied on it starts spinning. They wonder why you haven't reached out. They tell themselves stories to protect their pride. They must have moved on. It didn't matter anyway. But these are defensive whispers, and in the quiet, they don't hold up for long. Meanwhile, you've grown. What once felt like ego collapse has become emotional detachment, rooted in strength, not numbness. You're not waiting anymore, you're living. You've rebuilt your rhythm, reclaimed your time, and found a steadiness that doesn't depend on whether their name lights up your screen. This isn't about playing games. It's about rewriting your role entirely. You're no longer the chaser in a loop. You're the one who stepped out of the cycle. And that shift, though invisible, sends a clear message. You no longer operate in their emotional shadow. When avoidants sense that something deeper happens, their carefully crafted emotional distance starts to feel less like power and more like exile. They begin to experience the very feelings they've spent years avoiding: loneliness, regret, vulnerability. Some try to outrun it, diving into distractions, new flings, work, anything to avoid sitting with the void. But distraction can't silence what silence has exposed. Late at night, when everything else is quiet, their mind drifts back, not to the chase, but to the presence that's no longer there. The power of absence becomes undeniable. Some will test the waters again. A comment, a like, a sudden hey, as if months of silence never happened. Others might make a bolder move, reaching out directly, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. They want to know if the door is still open. But their return doesn't hit you the same way anymore. Their charm, their distance, their patterns. They're no longer mysterious, they're predictable. You can see the emotional machinery behind their actions, and that clarity strips their power of its old hold. Not every avoidant reaches out. Some retreat further, convincing themselves they don't need what they've lost. But the silence doesn't let them escape completely. It lingers. In small moments, in a quiet room, in the pause after someone asks about you. In the way their mind drifts unexpectedly, silence is patient. It doesn't need to push. It waits until the ego runs out of excuses for you. This stage is not about winning. It's about seeing you. See the entire pattern clearly now. The initial pull and retreat, the power games, the fear behind their control, your old reflexes to chase, and the quiet strength that grew when you stopped. You understand that closure was never something they could give you. It came the moment you stopped outsourcing your emotional stability to their responses. That's the final flip of the game. when their silence no longer defines you and your silence reshapes the entire dynamic. This doesn't mean they come back dramatically confessing everything. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The real shift happens inside you. You've stepped out of the loop. You've seen what the silence reveals on both sides. For them, it's the confrontation of their own walls. For you, it's the awakening of your worth. Whether they return, stay silent, or disappear into distractions, it doesn't control you anymore. The quiet space that once felt unbearable has become your foundation. Their reactions, or lack of them, are no longer a storm you're caught in. They're simply weather passing by, while you stand steady. That's the quiet power of this stage. The silence you both created no longer belongs to them. It belongs to you. In the end, it all comes back to silence. The same silence that once felt unbearable has become the stage where everything changed. What began as a pause, two people simply stopping contact, turned into a quiet battlefield where power shifted, illusions cracked, and identities were rebuilt. The avoidant who once relied on your pursuit now stands face to face with the weight of their own distance. And you've learned to stand still without collapsing. You've turned the quiet into clarity. The story isn't about who texts first or who wins the waiting game. It's about something much deeper. It's about what happens when you stop moving according to someone else's rhythm. When you stop trying to hold together a bridge that only you were walking on. When you stop chasing validation in someone else's responses and start finding it in your own silence. That's where transformation lives. Not in noise, but in stillness. For the dismissive avoidant, this moment exposes what their strategies were hiding all along. Strategic silence was their way of staying in control. But control built on the assumption that you'll always reach out is fragile. When you didn't, the game flipped. Their comfort zone turned into a mirror. The distance that once made them feel safe started reflecting their own fears back at them. The fear of being forgotten. The fear of needing. The fear of losing what they thought they could keep without effort. For you, this has been a quiet awakening. The silence that once triggered your insecurities has become your anchor. You've seen what happens when impulse fades and discipline takes its place. You've felt the shift from waiting to living, from chasing to observing, from reacting to leading. This isn't coldness, it's self-mastery. Stoicism in action, not in theory. The truth is, not every story ends with a reunion. Some avoidants will resurface, curious and disoriented, drawn back by the power of absence. Some will retreat even further, hiding behind pride and distractions. But none of that changes the real win. You stopped letting their silence define you. You became the calm in the middle of the storm. And that's something they can sense, whether they admit it or not. This is why silence is so powerful. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain. It reveals. It flips power dynamics without a single word. It exposes attachments, fears, and hidden needs. And for those who learn to stand in it, silence becomes the moment where everything shifts. Not just between you and them, but within you. If you felt this shift, if this story mirrors something real in your life, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. These quiet moments are universal, but most people never talk about them. You can be the reason someone else finds clarity in their own silence. And if this content spoke to you deeply and you want to support this work, consider using the Super Thanks feature below. Think of it less like a donation and more like fueling a message that cuts through the noise. A message that gives language to what people are silently living through. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and growing. The game flipped the moment you stopped moving on their terms. The power shifted when you stopped explaining and started observing. And the transformation happened when silence stopped being their weapon and became yours.